Hey everybody, welcome to The Real on Real Estate. I'm Taylor Johnson. I'm here with my dad, and one thing we have in common is we're both top producing realtors.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm Taylor's dad, and Taylor and I have a lot of things in common, but we also have some major differences. We live on opposite sides of the country. I'm one generation, she represents another. So if you're buying, you're selling, or just wondering, we're here to introduce you to a side of real estate that I'm certain you've never heard.
So thanks for following along, and let's get into it. Good morning, everybody. We are recording from Minnesota today. I'm with my dad. We've got Vaish online. Super excited to be here. And, in our last episode, we referenced this NAR settlement a couple of times. It's been a really hot topic of 2024 and is continuing through 2025. So we wanted to get into that in this episode of what this NAR settlement is and how it affects commissions in real estate.
Well, at least a portion of the NAR settlement, I guess, is this conversation about real estate fees and how they're paid and who pays them. So just to help you understand what a realtor goes through to get this process going and all the different National Association of Realtors, which is the NAR, and then there's another entity called the MLS, which is the Multiple Listing Service, which is ultimately the proprietary database that realtors use. And this is how we use it. So we go and we list a house and we want to put it, the term is put it on the market. And putting it on the market means putting it into the MLS so it creates visibility. And then what the MLS does is they take our inputs and they fan them out to multiple different sites that you're all familiar with that you go to so that there is access to the information.
Yeah, like we put it on the MLS and then it goes out to Zillow, realtor.com, homes.com, all the sites you're used to as a consumer of where to find a house.
Yes. And they do that for us, so we don't have to do that. But it requires a membership. We have to be members of the National Association of Realtors through our brokerage. Then we also have to be members of our local multiple listing service. And so it's regional. So when I go in and put a new house in, it's for my marketplace. Same thing for Taylor. They're completely unrelated. I don't have access to Taylor's MLS. She doesn't have access to mine. And you pay for that membership. And one of the items that goes into the inputs into MLS is compensation. And in our market, I'm a 6% lister. And so the division of that 6% is I retain 3.3% as my commission, as on the list side. And then I would pay out, or the seller would pay out, 2.7% to the buyer's agent. And we would write that into our MLS listing. So when an agent was about to show your house or investigating it, they would understand what the seller was paying for buyer compensation. That's typically 2.7%. That isn't to say that there isn't deviations from that. Sometimes they're 2.5, sometimes they're 2.0, but they go the other way too. They can be 3% or 3.3% as a strategy by the listing agent and their seller to maybe pay more than what is typical to give incentive to agents to show and sell their house and to receive additional compensation. So then in this whole NAR settlement is the conversation about why is the seller paying the buyer's agent's commission? Or why is there norms in markets? And is that evidence of price fixing if there is norms? So these expectations were set before I got into the business. I've been in it for a while, so this isn't new. This kind of 2.7 is an expectation by realtors in our market. But we all know that can change. and it has changed, and it's always changed in my career. I've seen it. But why did it start that way? I mean, that's part of the conversation.
And, one of the things that this NAR lawsuit highlighted was the compensation listed in the MLS is private. So realtors that have access to the MLS, they're the only ones that have access to the MLS, can go in there, look up a property, see how much they're going to get paid as the buyer's agent. But that commission is not listed on realtor.com or Zillow. So a buyer might not have any idea how much commission their agent is making representing them. They don't know if it's 2.7% or 2.5 or 3.3. And really, historically, since the seller has always paid the listing agent's commission and the buyer's agent commission, it's built into the purchase price. When a property is listed and put on the market, the 6% commission or 5.5% commission is built into the purchase price. So a buyer who doesn't know how much commission their agent is making might not understand how that's affecting their purchase price or their negotiation as the buyer. That's what this NAR settlement was highlighting, that there's an expectation that it's not being publicly shared with the buyer, that it does affect the transaction. However, I think my dad and I both feel like even though there are these expectations, commissions have always been negotiable. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've had deals before this NAR settlement that the seller was only offering a 2% payout to me as a buyer's agent. And I talked to my clients about that and said, I don't work for 2%. So we either need to ask the seller for a higher commission or the difference needs to come from the buyer. So I've been in situations even before this settlement that I've negotiated commission. But the whole lawsuit argued that it made it very difficult to negotiate because of the lack of transparency.
So a couple things on what you said. The example you gave was that you told your clients you don't work for 2%. Well, you do at times work for 2%. There's some scenarios that your fee is 2% because of that scenario. The other way of saying that is in their scenario, what they were asking you to do, you weren't going to work for 2%. And so somebody had to make up that difference. So we have both deviated from what is our typical fee structure because the situation, dictated otherwise. And if we're just to throw in some real life examples, is I had a house listed for $2 million. And some people came in an open house, and this just happened. And they came in the open house, spent an hour and a half there, loved the house, left, called the realtor who had never seen the house yet, said they want to buy it. Their agent came, took a look at it. They put a full price offer in on a $2 million house, and we paid out 2.7% to the buyer's agent on that. So you can not be very good at math, but do some really quick and say that is a tremendous amount of compensation for that role.
Yeah, for just getting a phone call from your client. You haven't even seen the house. You didn't find it for them, and they're ready to submit a full price offer and get a deal done.
Right. Now, they're going to add value to this transaction. This agent came in, very good agent, very competent agent. Have done transactions with this agent in the past, so it's not a question of their capabilities. But on the other side of it is their involvement coming in this late in the game and then transactionally just helping them with the last few pieces worth that full 2.7. I understand where there's some pushback from the market about why am I fixed with this 2.7%? when maybe the agent on the other side is actually hurting the transaction or working against them, which is what they should be doing. It's really healthy to have agents on the other side to have an adversarial position, meaning they represent only the best interests of their buyer. You have a listing agent on the other side that is only representing the interest of their seller. That's pretty healthy. But this is just an example that happened this week. So it gives you an idea how often questionable commission payments are happening if I can have one is, this recent.
But Taylor was saying that it's always been negotiable. So if it's always been negotiable, where is it just that people are not aware that it's been negotiable, or is it mainly about the transparency?
Both, I think. I think both. And that's the biggest change, I guess, with this settlement with NAR is that now compensation is no longer allowed to be listed in the multiple listing services, the MLS that we use as realtors. And the seller is under no obligation to pay for a buyer's agent commission. So it's no longer a field in the MLS. They're not required to pay anything. And now it's opened this whole can of worms of whether or not it's in the seller's best interest to still offer a compensation to the buyer's agent.
Because it's completely voluntary at this point, where with very few examples, in my career, have I seen a listing that doesn't upfront offer that, right? So, from that standpoint, it's a really big change.
Mm-hmm.
And now the conversations that we're having with our sellers is the benefits and cons of maybe committing up front to how much you're going to pay. And, maybe that's where this conversation should lead to is, what are our conversations like with our sellers? What advice are we giving to our sellers? And is it working?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I would love to hear that. Like, what are the pros and cons? Because it seems like as a buyer, to think about now having to be responsible for the commission, because it is ultimately the seller that's making the money and can factor it into the price of the house. That's the way my brain is working.
Yeah, and you and every buyer, right? They're like, wait a minute, I got to come up with more money. Why are they changing this? Because I'm already struggling to afford, the price of houses has gone up and interest rates are currently high and higher than what we've been used to for a while. Not necessarily historically high, but. And then they're all saying, well, why are they changing this on us now when there's no guarantee? And I think that concern is one that we have with our sellers, of letting them understand not only their perspective, but the buyer's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Because you said it exactly right, Vaish. The seller is the one making money. And on their closing documents, they have all these credits coming in of money that's coming in. And the buyer side is already a lot of debits with their origination fees for their loan, with their down payment. They have an appraisal if they're getting a loan, not to mention the out of pocket fees of inspections that they've already paid for in their escrow deposit. So that's why historically it's made a lot of sense for sellers to pay commissions for both the listing agent and the buyer's agent. And maybe now it still makes sense. It's just not a requirement. And that's what this whole settlement has forced to happen. That's actually a really good thing, is having these conversations. It's no longer kind of a hush hush what the buyer's agent is making and kept away from the public. Now it is a very important conversation that's happening from the beginning, and what strategies might be in play with that. So,
I I don't know if it was an intentional hush. It's
I
just
don't
that
think.
the buyers didn't really care as long as their agent was happy. There was some disconnection between them feeling like it mattered to them because they weren't paying it, the seller is. But obviously, they're paying it because it's included in the cost of real estate. So they are paying it. They're not coming up with the cash per se at the time of closing to pay it. So they have been paying it. And I don't attribute that to any sort of like malicious cover up by the industry. It's just they have to get paid for their services. And they just didn't have to have those conversations because
Right.
it wasn't necessary. Now it's really good. I mean, I think having these conversations, like you've already touched on, Taylor, is a win for the industry because I think buyers should have the right to say how much their agent's worth to them. Because, I just gave this example where an agent walked in. Well, that was a cash deal. Those sellers were paying, $2 million in cash for that house. And so those buyers, thanks.
Yeah.
And it wasn't lost on them, I'm sure. Like, wow, this agent's making a lot of money for this phone call that we have. So it isn't completely lost. But you know what? They moved forward knowing that because they understood that property was worth $2 million to them. How all the fees and how they all parlayed out, fine, whatever it is. We want her help in finishing this deal. We already know we like the house, but we also want to make sure we have somebody advocating for us was worth it to them. And so in that purchase agreement, she wrote in what her fees were. So it's very visible. Her clients knew. Now, she got that number because she asked if we were paying it, what our broker-to-broker compensation was. And, we had offered compensation 2.7% to the buyer and the buyer's agent. And so there was a lot of visibility of what was going on, and it didn't change the whole process because there was more visibility. Nothing changed. And so I think it's really good. I think there's an opportunity there where the buyer could have said, hey, instead of you getting 2.7 because you're coming in so late, how about we give you 1%, which would be, $20,000 on $2 million. And so you could put quite a few hours into helping them do that. But that opportunity was there. They didn't change it.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that it's holding realtors to a higher standard? Is that why you're saying it's a good thing because it brings some power back to the consumers?
Well, I think what I like about it is it makes agents demonstrate their value specifically to their clients. This industry is really diverse, and the capabilities of the people in it is really diverse. You meet some terrific, smart, capable agents, and you meet some, and you're just like, wow, right? They are not doing their clients a service. We see that whole range of people. If for the ones that are doing this job the way that I believe it was meant to be, then they don't have a lot of challenge demonstrating their commission value to be at those norms.
And standing behind their number, they're confident with those conversations. They're able to defend their position and get their clients to see exactly why they're asking for the commission that they are. Versus other agents might be extremely uncomfortable even talking about commissions, especially as a buyer's agent, because in the past, you didn't have to have those conversations a lot as a buyer's agent. If the seller, if it was listed in the MLS, 2.7% payout, you never had to talk to your buyer about it. You just saw you're covered. Okay, let's get a deal done. We don't even need to talk about it. Now nothing is listed in the MLS. Now people are offering 1%, 2%, 3% all over the place. 0%. So now you have to have a conversation every time. And a lot of agents are uncomfortable with that. And if you are uncomfortable with that, you're probably not worth the 2.7%, and you might not even be cut out for the industry.
Yeah,
Really?
well, I think Taylor.
Brutal.
I mean, Taylor is right. If you have enough experience to understand your value, then explaining that to people is you're very comfortable doing that. I mean, I know that I am. That's a good test. If you're uncomfortable doing it, it's probably because you really question if you're being overpaid, and that you can't defend it, and you don't want to put yourself in a position to have to defend it because you don't have a good argument, potentially. This isn't a question about if realtors are overpaid or not, because we know there's realtors that are overpaid. The old system allowed inferior agents to get the same compensation as superior agents. So the criticism of the industry and the concern, was warranted. And we get to see it on another side, which is when we're meeting new clients or being introduced to new clients, and the amount of horror stories that people have had with representation in the past is, I don't know anyone that's unaffected by it. It's true that, maybe it was them directly, maybe it was their children, maybe it was their parents, but everybody seems to have a story about being felt slighted in a real estate transaction by our industry. And for that, we deserve a lot of criticism. The other side of that is Taylor and I do this business to the very best of our ability. And I can look at everyone in the face and look them in the eyes and tell them that I really care about how this ends for them. And that's the passion that we bring to the industry. And we need to get compensated to do that because there is a lot of money at risk. We need to get paid a lot of money to make sure that the people are our priority and that we protect their long-term interests with good advice. And part of that advice comes from our experience, our firsthand experience, which is, I have so many years under my belt. Taylor has firsthand experience. She has so many years under her belt. But we also have relationships that we get to fall back on to take advantage of their experiences that we get to apply to our clients too. Taylor and I have conversations. I take things I learned from Taylor, introduce them because she's a trusted realtor for me to have conversations with. And we have other realtors that we talk to about important issues that we get to use their information to make our clients' experience better too.
And that's what this whole podcast is really about. We're getting I'm getting right now the very inside scoop of what real estate is really all about, and getting a completely new perspective on it than I would from just Googling it, or maybe, finding the first realtor that's on the Zillow page and going to them. So that's what this whole podcast is about. And it sounds like the settlement is a good thing for that very reason of it is holding people to a higher standard that maybe weren't operating at that standard. And it seems like it doesn't affect you guys that much, except for this part about how it ties into you have to be signed to see a house. Is that part of the settlement, right?
Yeah. So I think, we did touch on a component of this whole thing that there is some consumer benefit. And we see that because it has more conversations around commission. So there's more transparency. Now, with it, it's also introduced, some challenges in this process too. One of the things that, our brokerages are really pushing us is to ensure that we have a signed contract, prior to ever showing somebody a house.
Right, because before it used to be in the MLS. So before we showed a house, we already knew how much a seller was offering to a buyer's agent. And it was already written, and there was a history of it in the MLS recorded. So if we ever had any dispute, it was in the MLS. Now we don't have that. So our brokerages are really pushing these buyer representation agreements. And while before we had some protection with it being in the MLS, we don't have that anymore. So now our brokerages, mine is requiring, actually my entire county, St. Johns County in Florida, is requiring we have these buyer representation agreements signed before we even show a property, because our brokers want to ensure that they're making money, since sellers no longer have the obligation to pay our commission. So these buyer representation agreements state that in the event a seller is not willing to provide a buyer's agent commission, that the buyer will pay X amount to the buyer's agent.
Okay, so I'm gonna simplify it, kind of back it up a little bit, because what you said is 100% right. But just to fill in some blanks for people,
Yep.
is one component of a buyer representation agreement is compensation. The other pieces are ensuring that people understand what our roles and duties are. And it's a really wonderful document, because you do want your buyers to understand what your roles are and understanding what you're going to do for them. And so it's a great document that in my market, we've been doing it. Well, I've been doing it my whole career. We've had buyer representation agreements that were completed before we wrote offers. So, and that was a consumer protection step to make sure people understood who's in a real estate transaction, what are their responsibilities. So in that document is compensation. Where does it come from? And before, it just said, hey, it's being paid for by the seller. Don't you worry about it, but it comes from there. Now, the document says, hey, actually, we don't know where it's coming from, because we're talking to them before they've ever seen a house. We actually don't know where the compensation for my services is coming from. But just so you know, if we can't collect it out of the seller, we're collecting it from you. And we, as agents, get to decide how much that fee is. And we have to do it up front. And so going back to our norms, we're going to say 2.7% in our market. I do 3% a blanket on the buyer representation agreement. I always have the option that if something goes particularly smooth, to reduce that fee to them. I also have the option that if they sign an agreement with me for 3%, we find a house. I just did a deal. It was a $1.6 million deal. And that agent was paying out 2%. My agreement with them was 3%. I left it at 2%, and I didn't ask them to do the difference. And that decision was based on, the value of the property, how much time and effort that went into securing that property for them, how much time I spent with them, all those things. But the other factor that played into it is I sold their house for $3.4 million. So I did receive compensation on the sale of their house. I won't lie to you, it was one of the most labor-intensive transactions I've ever had in my career. And so I earned my compensation on the listing of it. And that was no fault of theirs. They're awesome people. It was just a very complex piece of real estate with a very challenging realtor on the other side. And it took a lot of time. But don't want to get too far away from what we're talking about. But those are the factors that go in. But now, in our agreements, before we ever show them a house, we have to make sure they understand if that seller isn't paying, you are. And this is how much it's going to be. And it's based on how much they spend. And that's completely negotiable. Unless somebody comes to me and says, hey, Matt, we found this house we need you to just help us do it. I don't know how much effort it's going to be to help them find a house and a buyer's rep. I'm going to stay at my 3%. And because that sets the top expense for them, so they know it could be 3%. We could get it out of the seller, might be completely negated by the seller, but they could be on the hook for some. And that's a very new conversation that, has changed since the settlement. Is we're having to tell them they have to get paid, or we have to get paid, and it might not be from the seller anymore. But the other piece of this whole thing, and I'm sorry for how complex this is, and it's part of the problem of our industry, but when you sign a representation agreement with me, Matt Johnson, and I'm going to help you find a house, you're not signing it with me. You're signing it with my brokerage. And the money goes to the broker. And then the broker takes their cut, an agreed upon cut. They get their agreements. Always have had those. And they're going to take a percentage of the commissions that are brought in. And that has the entire range. They could be taking 60%. The brokerage could be taking 60% of that commission. They could be taking all the way down to transactional dollars. Maybe some brokerages offer, you pay them $1,500 a transaction, and so it's not a percentage. But the money, it's important that people understand the agreement that you're signing isn't with the person that's in front of you, it's the brokerage they're with. And so if that agent leaves the brokerage, then you have to cancel that arrangement with that brokerage. The agent doesn't necessarily have the authority on their own to cancel an agreement with the brokerage. And I only bring that up is because that's what these agreements are through, is the brokerage, not the agent. So when we're making all these, and Taylor alluded to it before in something she said about, well, the broker wants to make sure they're getting their money. And so it's a piece that does enter in that people just don't understand because they're, it's kind of a process that it's too much information for a lot of people. They just, okay, I just need to hire you, you get it sold. And that's the extent. But that layer does exist in the equation, and it causes some problems at times.
So with all that being said, it's definitely changed our conversations with sellers specifically. And now there's this debate within the market of whether or not the seller should pay both sides of commission. Because like we already said, one benefit to the seller paying for it is that a lot of buyers just can't afford it. Right. Because they have all these other fees. So one benefit to the seller still offering a commission to the buyer's agent is it might open up a higher demand and pool of buyers because the seller is paying for it and it's not an expense needed from a buyer. Makes a buyer feel comfortable from the beginning. They don't need to worry about it. Their agent is motivated to show it. They know they're going to be paid. So that is one benefit to the seller continuing to offer a buyer's agent commission.
Yeah, and the way that I put it is actually the house that we're sitting in right now, I'm getting ready to put on the market here. And the way I explain it to my sellers is I can only tell you what I do for myself. And you get to decide what's best for you. But I'm getting ready to list this house. I am going to pay out the historical norm of 2.7. And I'm going to let every agent know that shows the house that I'm paying 2.7%. Because I never want to do something that takes away the incentive of the agent to persuade their client that my house is a good option for them. And you would have to be completely naive and ignorant to human nature if you didn't think that getting paid gives a salesperson incentive to get somebody to purchase an item or in our case, a house. And so I think personally that I'm gonna pay, and I'm gonna make people feel really good about getting paid, and I'm gonna factor in the cost that I have to pay to them into my ultimate decision if I sell it to somebody and for how much. I'm in complete control of that. I can I can pay the commission and have an offer that's unacceptable to me, and I just don't take it. So maybe that means I keep it because the market's not going to pay what I want to get for it. But those are my choices. And so I'm going to offer that. I explain that to my clients. I wouldn't risk pushing away a potential buyer because an agent is concerned about not getting paid what they feel that they've earned. And so my clients, I haven't had any real resistance from my sellers to pay out and advertise to pay out the commission rate to the buyer's agent.
Me either. I think it's been easy to explain and get them to be supportive that a lot of times it's in the seller's best interest to continue offering the buyer's agent commission.
So my question is, when you are already getting into a representation agreement and your realtor doesn't do a good job for you, how do you navigate that, or what can you do before that to make sure that you're not ending up as a buyer having to pay this sum of money for a realtor who didn't do a good job for you?
Within the contract, are you asking like within the contract, what can you do?
Or even before the contract to make sure that you're in a good place as a buyer?
Well, I think what we touched on is, the very first step is to do some networking and get names of realtors that people already vouch for. That's the first step. So you get into somebody that you have some sort of connection with. And then, I think throughout this podcast, we're going to give you some insights on the types of questions to ask, and get those answered. And then it comes the time to actually signing the contract. And so once you sign this agreement, one of the components to that is the compensation amount. And then let's just assume we're talking about trying to buy a house. And so having a conversation about what their compensation is if there isn't seller paid compensation, and how is that handled, and establishing communication so that every house that you do see, you understand which one it is. Are you going to a house? Hey, if you buy this house, you're going to have to come up with 3% to pay me because the seller's not willing to pay. It becomes a relevant conversation to have with your agent at every house. And so it's very important that you have that understanding about where that compensation is coming from before you make the offer on the house, because you wouldn't want to find that out after. And all of a sudden you have to come up with more money because the seller isn't paying any.
Okay, this was super helpful. I feel like I gained a lot from this episode. And so I'd love for you to give a few takeaways for people to understand what they need to know moving forward and how this NAR settlement will affect their life moving forward in their real estate journey.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground here, and so I think the key takeaways that, I want people to have is the idea of the NAR settlement was to bring more visibility ultimately to commissions. And I think there's been some real positive steps that are introducing commission conversations to a level they never were before. So how that affects you as a buyer is that you just want to make sure that you have a very clear understanding of compensation with your agent so that you don't end up buying a house and then find out you have another 3% expense that you didn't count on because the seller didn't pay it out. And then all of a sudden they're collecting from you. And so you just want to have a really open dialogue with your agent about that compensation on every house you see. And then on the other side of that, the seller, how is this impacting the seller? And I think you heard from Taylor and I that a seller offering compensation is probably the safest way to make sure that you appeal to all the different agents that are out there representing buyers. And I think if you stop for a moment as a seller and think about the buyer, and say, boy, the buyer could end up having to pay that agent and that on my house and not somebody else's. And maybe that's going to be the difference between them picking mine or not. And I wouldn't want to take that risk. Instead, I would want to factor the expense of the buy side real estate fees into what I'm willing to accept as a bottom line. And that is my advice. That's what I'm going to do for myself as I get ready to sell my own house. I'm not going to take the risk personally, and I do this every day. I'm gonna pay the buy side. So this is also evolving, and there's going to be a lot more changes as it comes, but our industry is adjusting. I think it's bringing some more visibility in a lot of ways and some better conversations about compensation.
Yeah. So you guys as consumers feel good about having those conversations with your realtor. Make sure you're working with a realtor that you feel comfortable in doing that. And again, like my dad said, this is evolving. We'll keep you guys up to speed and up to date as things carry over in 2025. But thank you for listening. And next time we'll get into
something else that would be very interesting. All right, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.